I've learned that silence can make a person disappear faster than death ever could. I stood with a wrapped box in my hands, the paper soft and faded at the corners from being reused too many times. The ribbon had come from the bottom of a drawer where things go when they're no longer meant to be seen. I had pulled it tight anyway, out of habit. You do your part. You show up. You don't ask questions. There was no invitation, not in the mail, not by word of mouth, not even a note left carelessly on the counter the way they leave grocery lists or half-sipped coffee mugs. Still I came. I convinced myself someone had simply forgotten that in the chaos of planning an anniversary party for 40 years of marriage, my name had slipped past the edge of memory. At the gate, a young woman in black slacks and a starched white blouse stopped me. She didn't look up at first. Her tablet buzzed in her hand. "You're not on the list." Her voice was flat, practiced, efficient. I didn't respond. I adjusted my grip on the box. The ribbon came loose and started to slide off the edge. She looked at me again. "This is for Mr. and Mrs. Prescott's celebration. It's private." I heard laughter from the patio, glass clinking forks, tapping china. The kind of sounds that pretend everyone inside belongs. I caught the edge of a song I recognized, something they used to play at church potlucks when Jamie was small. I waited for something inside me to rise up and protest to defend myself, but there was nothing. Then she appeared. Chloe. Her heels clicked against the flagstone, her dress tight and lilac. The kind of color that photographs well, but leaves no warmth behind. She looked surprised to see me, though her expression softened quickly into something more manageable, something public. "Oh, you came." She glanced at the young woman holding the tablet. "It's all right," she said before turning back to me. "We just didn't know you'd be coming, that's all. I didn't get an invitation." I answered, though my voice barely registered between us. Her smile tensed. "Well, it's mostly family, you know, and a few of Dad's business friends. It's not personal." The ribbon fell to the ground. "I'm sure you understand," she added. I bent to pick up the ribbon. My fingers fumbled with it longer than they needed to. Inside the garden, under a cream-colored tent, someone toasted the Prescotts. A round of applause followed, brisk and polite. Chloe stepped aside. "We'll bring you a plate later if you're hungry." I looked past her. The tables were dressed in white linen, gold-rimmed glassware folded napkins. One banner hung above the head table. Prescott Family and Friends, 40 Years of Grace. There was no chair left empty. She didn't say anything else. She didn't have to. At home, though, I hesitate to call it that, I folded the wrapping paper back into a square. The ribbon I tied in a loose knot and placed gently beside it. The gift itself, a wooden picture frame I'd refinished by hand, remained unopened. I put it on the shelf behind the bed where no one would ask about it. The house smelled like potpourri and lemon cleaner. Virginia didn't allow food in the guest room, but she sprayed every surface with something store-bought and artificial. I kept a small candle in my suitcase and lit it when I was alone. It smelled like tobacco and cedar, a scent that reminded me of worn flannel. And one good winter, Jamie was 12 then. We'd eaten chili in front of a borrowed heater, passing the cornbread in silence. The heater had broken that night, but he never complained. Earlier that morning, I'd ironed my best blouse, the one with the delicate stitching near the collar. The fabric had thinned around the elbows, but the buttons still held. I'd mended them with gray thread when white ran out. No one would notice. Or so I'd hoped. I'd written a small card for the Prescotts, 3 lines, no more. My pen had skipped halfway through the word honor, leaving a jagged edge. I didn't rewrite it. I folded it and tucked it under the ribbon. In the kitchen, before I left, Virginia had been slicing strawberries into a porcelain bowl. She hadn't looked up when I passed. "Make sure you stay out of the way today," she said. "We've got real guests." I nodded, though she wasn't watching. That afternoon, I drank tea alone. The mug had a small chip on the rim. I turned it toward the back so I wouldn't feel it on my lips. On the windowsill, a dead moth lay beside a cracked pane. I left it there. The house had 3 fireplaces, 5 bathrooms, and a kitchen with 2 sinks. But there was nowhere to sit where a body could simply rest without being reminded it didn't belong. Jamie used to say, "Just hold on till I'm back, Mama. We'll fix it." I hadn't told him yet. Not about the gift, not about the gate, not about the guest list. The garden outside bloomed on schedule. Virginia paid for professional landscapers. I watched them sometimes. They spoke Spanish and whistled while they worked. They never looked at the windows. I reread a recipe I'd copied down from memory. Apple pie the way Jamie liked it. I had no apples. The crust needed shortening I hadn't bought in months. Still, I folded the paper neatly and placed it between the pages of an old hymnal I'd brought with me. The last thing I did before turning out the light was remove the thin silver band from my finger. The inside still bore the initials AMC plus GWC. The letters were nearly worn smooth. I held it between thumb and forefinger not for sentiment, but to feel something that had once been real. Then I placed it in the drawer beside the gift. I didn't cry. Not when the ribbon fell. Not when Chloe stepped aside. Not when the card went unread. Not even when the silver band touched the wood of that empty drawer. I simply turned off the lamp. And in the dark, I chose not to speak. I never believed quietness would be mistaken for permission, but it often is. The first morning I made breakfast, I used eggs from the carton near the back of the fridge and a skillet that wasn't mine. I folded Jamie's favorite recipe into something simpler. Less butter, no cheese. The yolks broke in the pan, but I served them anyway, neatly arranged beside toast that was more dry than crisp. No one sat down. I rinsed the plate and left it in the drying rack with the sponge folded beside it. The smell of citrus soap clung to my fingers long after the water cooled. Later, Chloe told me not to use the red dish towels. "Those are display," she said, glancing down at the cloth in my hand. "The white ones are in the back cabinet. Use those for actual cleaning." I folded the red towel back carefully, as if it might catch fire from being handled too long. She didn't look at me again. In the first week, I trimmed the hedges, only a little, just enough so they wouldn't look overgrown from the sidewalk. I wiped the porch railing with an old sock I kept in my suitcase. The sock had belonged to Jamie in high school, though the elastic was long gone. I used it anyway. Cotton holds better than anything synthetic. Virginia saw me through the window. She came out not to thank me, but to mention that the landscapers had a schedule. "We don't want the neighbors thinking we can't manage our own home." I nodded. The sock stayed in my coat pocket after that. I never touched anything with a price tag still attached. The crystal bowls in the sideboard. The ironed napkins in the linen chest. The set of pewter measuring cups Virginia kept, lined like soldiers in the kitchen drawer. I used my own mug for tea, a chipped one with bluebirds that had followed me from my old house. Jamie gave it to me after his first school play, when he played a tree and forgot all his lines. The birds had started to fade, but one wing remained intact. One morning, Chloe handed me a piece of paper folded in thirds. The handwriting was neat, measured. Mondays, upstairs bath. Tuesdays, kitchen cabinets. Wednesdays, patio sweeping. At the bottom, she'd written, "We thought this would help keep things organized. Just temporary, of course. Until Jamie gets back." I kept the list. Not to remember, but to prove I hadn't forgotten. When Jamie called, I asked how the weather was. He said the nights were cold, then quieter. "Just hold on a few more weeks, Mama. We'll figure it out soon." I told him I was fine, that the guest room had a small lamp with a green shade. I didn't mention the mustiness or the light bulb that flickered every third breath. After the call, I wrote him a letter. 3 pages, then 2, then 1. By the end, I had crossed out everything except the words, "I'm proud of you." I folded it in half and never mailed it. Virginia had company the following Friday. 2 women with short hair and matching purses. They sat in the formal room and sipped coffee from china cups I hadn't known existed. I was asked to bring in cookies. "This is Anita," Virginia said when I entered. "Jamie's mother. She's staying here for now. Makes things easier logistically." One of the women looked at my shoes. The other didn't look at all. I placed the tray on the coffee table and stepped back. A sugar cube had fallen off center. I let it stay that way. Chloe passed me in the hallway later that day. She didn't smile. "We appreciate your help around here. I know it must give you a sense of structure." I folded a dish towel with my hands behind my back. Mama used to say she added idle hands are a dangerous thing. "I think it's good that you keep busy." I nodded again. That gesture had become its own language. In the evenings, I washed my clothes in the bathroom sink. Their machine had settings I didn't recognize, and once Virginia mentioned the electricity bill in passing. I used a bar of soap wrapped in tissue and hung my blouses on wire hangers near the vent. On colder nights, they took longer to dry. One of Jamie's old shirts had a rip in the sleeve. I mended it by hand with thread from a hotel sewing kit. The patch didn't match. I folded it carefully anyway, smoothing the seams until the fabric settled. I learned the rhythm of their home quickly. When to speak, when not to. Which drawers creaked. Which lights were always left on. Chloe hummed while vacuuming but stopped if she noticed anyone listening. Virginia watched cable news with the volume too low to hear, and Harlan spoke mostly through the newspaper, flipping each page like a door that wouldn't stay closed. No one asked about my room. No one asked what I had left behind. The wedding ring I still wore had dulled around the edges. The stone was missing. I twisted it sometimes more out of habit than memory. The finger underneath had thinned. One afternoon, I found a handwritten note on the kitchen counter. It wasn't addressed to me, but I read it anyway. "Mom, don't forget to remind Anita not to use the main bathroom. Guests are coming Friday." She should know better by now. The words were in Chloe's hand. The sentence, "She should know better by now," stayed with me long after I had folded the note and dropped it into the trash. I didn't speak of it. I didn't mention the way my name always came up at the end of sentences, never the beginning. Sometimes I ironed pillowcases that hadn't been asked for. Sometimes I peeled potatoes just to feel the weight of something ordinary in my hands. The peels curled like paper, silent and obedient. In the guest room, I kept a jar of coins Jamie had collected as a boy, mostly nickels and wheat pennies. I shook it once just to hear something respond. Virginia passed me in the hallway with a load of fresh towels. "You don't need to be in the way all the time," she said without stopping. The towels were white, folded in thirds, stacked like absolutes. I didn't reply. I stood where I was in the narrow strip between hallway and staircase and waited until the scent of lavender bleach disappeared. Then I went back into my room and closed the door without sound. In the stillness, I pressed my palm against the inside of my wrist. The skin felt thin there, a place where even quiet had a pulse. It's strange how a name can vanish from rooms you still walk through. The Christmas card arrived in a red envelope. Heavy paper embossed in gold. I found it tucked between grocery ads on the kitchen counter, already opened its flap, bent back, as if it had been handled in passing. To the wonderful Prescott family, the print read centered and neat. Below, a signature from a neighbor I didn't know, followed by a short note. Grateful for your kindness this year. Hope to see you at the New Year's brunch. I stared at it longer than necessary. There was nothing to correct. No error to point at. Just absence, clean and deliberate. I tucked it back into its envelope and placed it in the drawer beside the stove where old receipts and appliance warranties collected. No one noticed. That night, the smell of cinnamon drifted from Virginia's oven. I wasn't asked to help. I sat at the far end of the living room with a folded blanket across my knees. It had a stitched monogram VP in the corner. The blanket wasn't mine, but I used it anyway. It kept the silence from settling too deep. Last October, Jamie's birthday came and went. Chloe hosted a small gathering at a restaurant downtown. I saw the photos later on her phone when she left it on the kitchen island screen still lit. They had written, "Our little family's biggest heart," under a picture of Jamie holding a cake. I hadn't known there was a cake. She never mentioned it. When I brought home a box of his favorite chocolates the next day, dark truffle with sea salt, she smiled in a way that felt practiced. Oh, he's cutting back on sugar. But thank you. I left them on the counter. By evening, the box was gone. Months earlier, Jamie had been honored in a ceremony, a promotion. Chloe accepted the certificate on his behalf while he was still stationed out of state. There had been speeches, photos, even a newspaper blurb. I learned about it from a clipping that Virginia left on the breakfast table. "He's doing well," she'd commented without looking up from her coffee. Chloe represented the family beautifully. I nodded, though I had never been asked. No mention had been made of the jacket Jamie wore in the photo, the same one I had sewn a button onto 2 years ago after it caught on a fence post. I recognized the loose thread under his collar. I didn't mention it. One afternoon, 2 of Chloe's friends visited. They sat around the dining table sipping something pale from tall glasses. I passed through the room on my way to the laundry. Chloe was laughing, one hand resting on her friend's wrist. His first car. "Oh, that old Honda. My parents helped him with that. We had to beg the guy at the lot to knock a few hundred off." The words floated behind me. I had worked double shifts that month. Factory hours. My hands still carried the shape of tools, long after the machines were gone. I never told Jamie. He'd offered to sell the car years later when I needed money for George's medication. I said no. It had been the only thing he'd ever truly owned on his own. Sometimes I found my name on packages from the pharmacy, always printed in bold, Anita M. Callahan. There was comfort in the weight of ink and legal necessity. The rest of the house didn't use my name at all. At dinner, Harlan once turned to Chloe after I cleared the dishes. "Does she always dry the forks first?" "That's not how we do it." He didn't look at me. I was 3 feet away. Chloe folded her napkin, then placed it gently beside her plate. "It's a habit, I think. Best not to interrupt her rhythm." I remembered her voice in that moment more than the words. On the fridge, between a child's school calendar and a coupon for dry cleaning, a photo strip from a summer fair had been pinned with a sunflower magnet. Jamie, Chloe, and Virginia. 3 faces, half laughter, wind-blown hair. A Sharpie note read, "Prescott Day out. Just us 3. I touched the corner of the magnet and straightened it. That evening, I folded towels in the hallway. Virginia passed by carrying a tray of cleaned wine glasses. "You know, she said some people are better suited for quiet support roles. Nothing wrong with that, as long as they know their place." She disappeared into the next room. I folded another towel. Jamie once told me he admired how I handled things with grace. That was his word, grace. I remember wondering after he said it, whether grace meant not being seen or being seen and not minding. When I was 23, a belt from a conveyor caught my hand at the factory. 3 fingers crushed, gone before the pain even settled. I learned to write again with the other hand. I stitched, buttoned, tied, stirred, peeled, all slightly off balance, but still done. No one ever complained about crooked seams. Now that hand folds pillowcases and scrubs corners that don't belong to me. The scar has long since smoothed over. But on cold mornings, the palm aches without warning. Tonight I held that hand against the light and watched the way the skin thinned near the wrist. There is something about the parts of us we've lost that never quite leave. They just quiet down. In the drawer beside my bed, the Christmas card lies flat beneath a napkin I embroidered years ago. The thread has faded. The words above the door still say, "Home is where the heart is, but not in this room." I haven't heard my name spoken aloud in days. And yet I remain, not to be included, not to be remembered, simply to bear witness to the space I still occupy, even when no one else does. Some silences have weight, others only echo. The gloves I wore were thin, clear plastic too loose for my hands. They crinkled when I moved, never quite fitting. I had used the same pair all afternoon, rinsing them between tasks and drying them on a rag that used to be a shirt sleeve. There were better gloves in the pantry. I wasn't supposed to use those. I knelt at the edge of the rug where the tile met the wood. A small smear of something, maybe wine, maybe polish, had caught the light from the chandelier above. I had wiped it twice already, but I kept going. Circles, gentle pressure rinse. Circles again. I hadn't been invited to the tea. The women sat on ivory chairs in soft pastels and pearl earrings. China clinked softly between sips. The room smelled of lilac and lemon zest. Chloe wore a blue silk blouse with tiny shell buttons and gestured often as she spoke. Her laugh was round and light like something rehearsed for company. I stayed low, half hidden, behind the coffee table. My bucket was tucked behind the settee. It had a crack along the rim. I turned it so the line faced the wall. "This is the formal sitting room," Chloe said, motioning with her glass. "It's where we host. Of course we keep it spotless." Except she paused for effect, glancing down. "Mama Jamie had a little accident with the rosé yesterday. But we're used to that now, aren't we?" A few heads turned. No one spoke. One woman stirred her tea as if trying to draw circles in the cup. Virginia crossed her legs slowly. Her voice was almost fond. "She's simple folk, raised on the practical side of things. Not everything can be taught, you know. Some people just don't come from order." Someone chuckled. "The kind that barely touches the teeth." I pressed my palm flat to the floor. The streak they were talking about wasn't new. It had been there the day I arrived. A flaw in the tile, or a faded seam in the glaze. It caught light oddly, but it wasn't dirt. I had checked more than once. I looked up, careful not to meet anyone's eyes. I just wiped it. "What you're seeing is the light." Chloe turned her full body toward me, one hand still raised mid-gesture. She set her glass down hard enough for the base to click against the tray. "Don't correct me in front of guests." The room shifted. One woman adjusted her purse strap. Another looked down at her lap. I nodded. I reached for the rag again. Chloe's heel tapped once, then she crossed the room. She stood above me, finger extended. "It's dirty." I kept wiping. "I said it's filthy." Her hand moved before I saw it coming. The slap wasn't loud. Just enough to send the sound into the space between voices. A sharp punctuation at the end of an unfinished sentence. The room froze. Virginia lifted her cup and blew gently across the rim. She means well. But Chloe was raised to uphold standards. Sometimes standards require firmness. Someone coughed. Someone else shifted in her seat. I touched my cheek. Not hard, just enough to cover the warmth rising beneath the skin. The rag in my hand had fallen half wet. The edge of it dipped into the bucket and darkened. Chloe picked up the mop handle and dropped it into my lap. Again, she said, "This time like it matters." The handle rolled once, bumping against my wrist. I reached for it. One woman's short hair, gray root stood and said she had another appointment. The rest rose slowly in staggered pairs. Their coats made soft, rustling sounds as they reached for their handbags and gave polite smiles in the doorway. I remained kneeling. Later, I found my reflection in the window glass. Not clear, just the blur of a face shaped by the frame. The light outside had dimmed. The outline of a tree stretched across the sidewalk like a shadow that didn't belong to anything alive. The gloves were still on my hands. I peeled them off one finger at a time. My skin underneath had gone damp and wrinkled. I let the gloves drop into the trash. No one spoke to me after the guests left. No one offered a cloth or an apology. I stood in the hallway for a long while, watching the space where the mop had fallen. The tile still bore the faint curved mark of water, drying in uneven circles. I didn't scrub it again. Not because I had proven anything, only because silence too deserves a shape. Some decisions don't arrive all at once. They unfold quietly like a thread slipping loose from a sweater you don't realize is unraveling until it's nearly gone. The overhead bulb flickered again, soft and uneven. I had stopped reaching up to tighten it. Chloe said it gave the room a mood. I never asked what mood she meant. My room, if it could be called that, had once been a coat storage area. They cleared it out for me and put in a cot. No door, just a curtain rod where jackets used to hang. I sat cross-legged on the mattress holding the teacup I'd kept from the thrift store, my one thing in the house that belonged to no one else. The rim had a faint crack just visible when the light hit it from the side. I never drank from it. I just liked having it near. The silence was familiar, not soothing. A kind of stillness that doesn't ask questions. That night it came with a particular weight, not heavier than usual, just clearer. My cheek had stopped stinging hours ago. The warmth had faded, replaced by something that lived deeper in the bone. Not pain, something quieter. Jamie's message had come earlier. "You okay, Mom? I'll be home this weekend." 3 sentences. No punctuation beyond the question mark. His voice had always been like that when he didn't know what was wrong, only that something probably was. I hadn't replied. Not because I didn't want to, because I wasn't sure which part of myself still knew how. The last thing I wanted was for him to feel guilt, where responsibility belonged elsewhere. My suitcase was under the cot. I pulled it out slowly. It made a soft scrape against the tile floor. Inside, 2 neatly folded sweaters, a pair of slacks, a scarf from my sister's funeral, and an old radio that didn't work anymore. I kept it because it had belonged to George. He used to leave it playing in the garage, even when he wasn't there. Music with no audience, like a promise not yet broken. I added the essentials: a pair of walking shoes, the envelope with our mortgage papers still sealed from the day we lost the house, a rosary I never used but couldn't throw away, a ring Jamie gave me when he was little, a green plastic toy from a gumball machine still tucked inside the cotton from its capsule. From the kitchen came the sound of a knife against a cutting board. Virginia humming something under her breath. A game show playing faintly from the living room. The world outside my room carried on like any other night. But for me, something had ended. I picked up a notepad from the side drawer, the one with pale flowers and a tiny gold P in the corner. Virginia's stationery. I'd never used it before. Tonight it didn't feel like stealing. I wrote slowly, carefully. One line. I appreciate the temporary roof, but I am not the help. I am not a secret to be hidden. Anita. No anger in the pen, no tremble, just ink and truth. I folded the paper once and placed it beside the sink. On the counter sat Virginia's silver napkin ring collection, each engraved with a different initial. They were polished every Sunday. I had once offered to help, and she said without looking up, "Polishing isn't just about effort. It's about having the eye for refinement. Not everyone does." Behind me, Chloe's voice rose light and breezy. "She's always hovering. I think she thinks cleaning gives her a place here." Virginia responded slower. "It's habit. Some women confuse service with value." The words weren't meant to wound. That was what made them effective. I didn't turn around. The coat I wore that night was one Jamie had left in high school. Too big for me. The sleeves covered my wrists entirely. The lining had torn near the inside pocket, and I had stitched it back with navy thread. It didn't match, but it held. I slipped it on. I tucked the note under a salt shaker to keep it from fluttering away if someone opened a window. Before I left, I reached into the cupboard and took down the chipped mug I always used, white with a faded blue rim. I had once found it in the back corner behind rows of porcelain ones that matched. No one ever picked it but me. I placed it upside down on the counter beside the note. No one saw me walk down the hall. No one called after me. I passed the living room. The television glowed. Chloe and Virginia sat with their feet tucked neatly under afghans. A tray of cheese and crackers on the table. They didn't look up. My suitcase rolled gently behind me, wheels humming against the hardwood. I stepped onto the mat at the door. The word welcome had started to peel at the edges. A leaf was caught under the corner. I opened the door with care. No slam, no statement, just movement. The porch light cast my shadow in two directions. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't leave in fury. But I left. Not because I was brave. Not because I had something better waiting, but because silence, when it turns from endurance to choice, becomes its own kind of declaration. Some people measure safety by locks and alarms. I've started to think it's measured by whether anyone has the right to knock without asking. The room was small, almost square. The mattress dipped slightly on one side, and the headboard had a scratch in the shape of a crooked V. The faucet in the sink needed coaxing to stop dripping. There was a single window, high and narrow, with a screen that buzzed faintly when the wind came through. But there were no footsteps above me. No voices on the other side of the wall telling me how I was being perceived. No lists, no watchful eyes, just me and the smell of fresh paint that couldn't quite hide the old. I unpacked slowly. A few shirts, 2 sweaters, socks that didn't match anymore. I lined them along the single shelf in the closet and kept one drawer empty, maybe out of habit or reverence. My bag leaned against the nightstand. I didn't have a lamp, just the overhead bulb that clicked when I flipped the switch. It wasn't warm light, but it was mine to turn on or off. The first morning I woke before the sun, not from a noise, but from the stillness. My hands shook when I made the coffee. The packet tore too easily, and the plastic spoon snapped at the neck. I stirred with the handle anyway. It tasted like cardboard and burnt air, but I stood in the middle of the room and drank it like it had been served on china. No one corrected me. No one watched. There were $27 in my wallet. I counted twice just to be sure. It felt like both nothing and everything. I stood in front of the small bulletin board near the stairwell. A flyer hung crooked mailboxes for rent. Personalized labels available, rumors welcome. The woman at the front desk wore bright pink nail polish and didn't ask questions. I gave her $5 and spelled out my last name. "Callahan," I said clearly. She looked up just once. That's your box now. Number 4. The metal creaked as I opened it. Empty. Still, I smiled. There was a name on it now. My name. Back in the room, I placed the receipt in the drawer with the broken zipper. I opened the window all the way, though the wind snapped through like it didn't quite belong. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once. A bird answered. And that, too, felt like something I didn't need to apologize for. I folded a towel over the back of the chair. I had brought only one. The ends were frayed, the threads curling away from the seams. It had been Jamie's when he was small. Yellow with a rocket ship that had long since faded to a vague outline. I sat on the edge of the bed and ran my thumb along the stitching. Not to remember, just to know I hadn't forgotten. That afternoon, I walked 2 blocks to the grocery store. I picked out a jar of peanut butter, a loaf of bread, and a can of soup I didn't really like, but it was on sale. I passed a rack of magazines near the checkout, their covers shouting lives that weren't mine. I glanced at a headline, How to Be Chosen. I moved past it without touching. At the corner near the laundromat, a woman stood holding a clipboard. Would you like to sign up for our church pantry? I smiled gently and kept walking. Not yet, I thought. Not out of pride. Just not yet. That night I wrote Jamie a letter, not a message, a letter. On plain white paper, the kind sold in 10-cent stacks at the dollar store. I didn't say where I was, only that I was safe and that he didn't need to worry. I told him I remembered his favorite dinner, and that I hoped he was still folding his socks in pairs, not stuffing them in drawers like he used to. I folded the page in thirds and placed it in an envelope. I didn't write his name on the front. It sat on the table for 3 days before I finally tucked it into the back of the drawer behind the towel. Some words are only meant to be written, not read. The building was quiet after 9. Sometimes the pipes groaned, or someone down the hall sneezed with the door open. No one played loud music. No one banged on the walls. No one cared what I was doing at any given hour. And for the first time in years, I breathed without needing to make it smaller. One morning, the floor was cold, and I stood barefoot longer than I needed to, just because no one would tell me to move. I watched the light shift across the linoleum, a slow parade of gray to silver. I didn't speak. Not out of silence, but because there was no one to speak for. I didn't miss the place I'd left. That surprised me. What I missed, if anything, were things that had stopped existing long before I packed my bag. The sound of Jamie's laughter before the house got filled with other voices. George's old humming when he cooked eggs too runny. A sense that my presence was not just permitted but wanted. Now there was no one to judge how I stacked the dishes. No one to glance at my hands and make a face at the uneven nails. No one to whisper in the next room as though I didn't know I was being discussed. The mirror above the sink was too low. I had to bend my knees slightly to see my face fully. I did it once. My reflection didn't startle me. It didn't pity me. It didn't speak. But it stayed. Each evening, I locked the door with the one key they gave me on a faded green plastic tag. The number had rubbed off. That suited me fine. It wasn't for anyone else to read. The hallway was narrow. Pale blue paint with spots where older colors tried to show through. A plant wilted in a plastic pot near the stairs. No one seemed to water it. I stood just inside the door one night, hand on the knob, and looked out through the crack. The hallway hummed with its own kind of quiet. I could hear my heart again, not loud, not brave, but steady. For once, I didn't wait for someone to call me back. I turned the key once and left the silence exactly where it belonged. I never liked the sound of metal keys clinking in a pocket. It always reminded me of someone about to walk away. Jamie used to carry his on a small brass ring worn smooth from years of use. I used to know that sound. I hadn't told him where I was. Not exactly. Just left that note on the counter short and folded twice. I'd written it with my best pen, the one with blue ink that doesn't smudge. I didn't write my address. I only said I needed air. I heard from the front desk that a young man had come asking for me. She said he looked like someone who hadn't slept on the plane. She said he carried a duffel bag and didn't smile. I sat in the laundry room for half an hour after that, pretending I had a load to do. When he did find me, I was fixing the light bulb above the stove. He stepped in through the open door, and for a second I could still hear that little key ring from when he was 10 and proud of his first house key. That's how far back it went in my mind. He looked at the room first. Not at me. The single burner, the cot pressed against the wall, the water stains in the ceiling tiles. Then he looked at my hands. The skin was cracked again. I'd run out of ointment last week. You live here. He didn't sit down. I nodded. It's quieter than it looks. He walked over to this window and pulled the curtain back. It stuck a little on the rod. The view was just a brick wall. Mom, what happened? I opened the cupboard to take down the tin of crackers. I wanted to give you time. With Chloe. Your new life. Did you leave, or were you pushed out? There was a mug by the sink. It still had tea leaves dried at the bottom. I hadn't gotten to the dishes that morning. He stepped closer. His voice didn't raise. Did someone lay a hand on you? The mark had faded to a soft yellow. I'd been careful not to sleep on that side. He noticed anyway. His eyes narrowed. Tell me who did that. I didn't answer. Not out of loyalty, just because I knew it wouldn't matter. The damage was already moving in him like a tide coming up over rocks. She told me you were unwell, he said quietly. That you were confused, forgetful, that you'd chosen to leave. I didn't forget anything I said. His shoulders sank. The silence between us felt dense, like dust settling on a table no one used anymore. He didn't stay long, just enough to look around again and see every crack he hadn't noticed from far away. When he left, he pressed my shoulder the way his father used to when words weren't enough. I watched the hallway long after he'd gone. 2 days later, the apartment door creaked open again. This time it was Jamie with a suitcase and a plastic bag of groceries. He set them down like he'd always lived there. He didn't bring up Chloe, not right away. That night, we ate canned soup with toast on paper plates. He folded the napkins into neat triangles, like the army taught him. She laughed when I told her I was moving out, he said. Told me I'd come crawling back once I realized who really had my back. I sipped the broth still too warm and didn't look up. He leaned back in the chair. You know what she told her parents? She's not one of us. She doesn't know how to behave in a real home. The chair creaked under him. He didn't slam his hand. He just sat very still. I thought I married someone with backbone. Turns out she needed someone to stand on. I thought of the crystal bowl she made me dust every day. I never knew what went in it. It was always empty except for reflections of whoever stood over it. I filed, he added. I didn't respond. I didn't want to ask for the details. She told me. You're overreacting. It was just a slap. Like I was talking about some neighbor's dog. There was a pause. She said, Your mother's always been too sensitive. Why do you think she's alone? That was the only part that stung. Jamie pulled a folded sheet of paper from his coat. She wanted you to sign this. Some settlement garbage. It starts with, Thank you for your understanding. He tore it in half without reading the rest. I opened the small drawer by the sink and slid out the old letter I'd written to him months ago but never sent. I handed it over without a word. He read it once, then again. Why didn't you send this? I shrugged. Some things sound too loud when you put them on paper. He stood up and placed it on the table like it was something breakable. We're not going back there. Not for visits. Not for Christmas. I'm done pretending. There was a quiet after that, the kind that doesn't ask for anything. Not an apology. Not even comfort. Just the sound of a heater kicking on and the faint buzz of a streetlight outside. Later, as I wiped the table down, he looked over and said, "You were never the one who had to change. They just didn't know how to see you." I folded the cloth corner to corner and placed it back where it belonged. I didn't speak. I just touched the mailbox key in my pocket, the one with the faded blue sticker I'd added, and thought for the first time in a long while, I'd like to keep the sound it made when it turned. There's a quiet kind of dignity in folding laundry that's warm from the dryer. I never noticed it before. At the old house, the machines had digital screens, multiple cycles, and detergent pods in glass jars. Here, the knob clicks hard to the right, and the rinse never quite gets everything out. Still, each towel I fold smells like something we picked ourselves, like clean, not money. Jamie found the apartment while I was asleep. He came back with a rental agreement in one hand and 2 houseplants in the other. "You get the sunny bedroom," he said. I snore. It had a chipped countertop and floors that creaked if you stepped too hard near the radiator. But it had space. And it had silence, not the kind that isolates, but the kind that listens. I hung my old coat on a hook near the door and didn't touch it for a week. The first night we had cereal for dinner. Jamie poured too much milk and spilled a little on the table. He cleaned it up with his sleeve. I didn't correct him. "Mornings are different when you don't brace for someone's voice," he said once while frying eggs. The yolk broke in the pan, and he looked down like he'd failed an exam. I laughed. Not out loud, not like a show. Just enough that he turned his head and smiled without saying anything. "You laughed," he murmured. I took the plate and set it down. Don't get used to it. One good egg doesn't fix 20 years of burnt toast. We never had a ceremony. No big talk where we forgave each other or unpacked every silence we let grow. It was more like patchwork. He'd wash the dishes, and I'd fold his undershirts the way I used to when he played Little League. He left the porch light on for me. Once when I came back late from the library, I hadn't asked him to. That was enough. I volunteered 3 days a week at the town branch. They let me shelve returns and dust the poetry aisle. On Thursdays, I sat near the windows and read children's books out loud to whoever showed up. Mostly, it was no one. Once a little girl with a green beret asked why my hands looked like tree bark. I told her they held a lot. Jamie started going to therapy. He said it helped to have someone who didn't share a last name. I nodded. I didn't ask what he talked about. Some evenings we cooked side by side. He learned to mince garlic without crushing it. I learned that it's okay to eat late when no one's judging. Once, he looked up from chopping and said, "You know what's strange? I never realized how quiet you were until I heard other people speak over you." I dried my hands on a dish towel and shrugged. Most people don't realize what they drown until the water drains. He nodded slowly. I used to think Chloe was strong. Turns out she was just loud. It happened on a Wednesday. There was a knock, firm, not angry. I opened the door, and she was there. Chloe. No makeup, no pressed blouse. Her coat looked wrinkled, like she'd worn it in a car with the heat turned too high. Her eyes were red, not the kind of red you use for sympathy, the kind that comes after arguing with yourself and losing. "I'm not here to fight," she said. I didn't answer. She stepped back as if expecting me to shut the door. "I messed up, I know. I don't even know how to start apologizing." I waited. Her voice cracked a little, but it wasn't performance. It was the sound of someone who had run out of excuses. I was jealous, she said. He looked at you like you were the center of everything. And I wanted that. I looked past her. The hallway light flickered slightly. Jamie walked up behind me and stood in the doorway. I didn't come to fix anything, Chloe added. I just wanted you to know that I see it now. Everything. Jamie didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for me or for her. You thought you had to choose between being respected and being kind. So you chose the version of power that stepped on people. She blinked. I was scared. I thought if I didn't control things, I'd lose them. He nodded once. You were right. You did. She turned to me. I used to think I had to earn love by being the loudest in the room, but you just were. I folded my hands in front of me. You once told me silence was my best trait. I think you were right. There's nothing left I need to say. She looked down, then nodded. I understand. Jamie closed the door quietly. No slam, no final word. Later that night, he poured 2 glasses of iced tea and sat across from me. I think she thought you were a placeholder, he said, like something temporary she could rearrange. I stirred my drink with the handle of the spoon. Some people confuse stillness with weakness. But stillness sees everything. He exhaled. We're okay, right? I traced the condensation ring on the table. We're not broken, just rearranged. And that was true. He still had the habit of leaving his socks under the couch. I still folded the grocery bags, even when we didn't reuse them. But we said goodnight like it meant something, not like a habit. That was enough. Later, when I looked out the window, the porch light was still on. And I didn't wonder who turned it on or why. I just let it glow. There's a kind of quiet that only shows up when you stop waiting for permission to be yourself. I started shelving the returns faster at the library, not because someone timed me, but because I knew where things belonged. That feeling of placing something back in its rightful space carried more weight than I expected. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, I worked beside Clary Dale. She wore brooches shaped like animals and said children listened better if you whispered rather than spoke. They lean in, she told me once, pointing to her throat. They only block out noise, not silence. Tom Beckett wasn't the kind of man who made entrances. He arrived like bookmarks, unassuming, always fitting in quietly. He came for the British section, Austen Hardy Eliot. At first, he only nodded as he passed me by. One day, he lingered his fingers hovering over the spines of forgotten hardcovers. You reshelved The Mill on the Floss? Wrong, he said, not unkindly. I looked over. I wanted to give it a better neighbor. That earned a small chuckle and a shake of his head. He wore sweaters that had been washed too many times, and his shoes creaked slightly on the floor. He walked like someone who used to hurry, but didn't anymore. A week later, he left a small box on the counter with a note that said, I heard you like pecans. My late wife used to say they were God's apology for bitter walnuts. The cookies were uneven, some crispier than others, but they tasted like something made while humming, not measuring. I brought back an apple I'd sliced too early that morning and handed it to him on a napkin. Not an apology, just a balance. Saturday afternoons became a quiet ritual. 1 black coffee, 1 herbal tea, no sugar. We never made plans. We just showed up. And that I realized was the most honest form of wanting someone there, not needing them to promise just letting them return. He never asked about my son, my marriage, or the reason I flinched when someone raised their voice near the copier. I told him anyway. Bits and pieces, never in order. Like laying out fabric scraps without a pattern. One Thanksgiving. I said once I was told to sit in the kitchen until I was needed. And then I wasn't. He stirred his drink slowly. Silence, when used as a weapon, is always sharpest at the dinner table. When Jamie handed me the copy of the finalized divorce papers, he placed them on the counter gently, like he thought I might need time. The envelope was unsealed. "You don't have to look," he said, "but I thought you might want to keep it." I traced the edge of the paper with my finger. The ink was still fresh. Chloe's signature curled at the end like a leaf burning at the edges. "I don't need to," I replied. "What I wanted to save isn't on that page." I pressed my palm to my chest, over my blouse. "It's already here." He nodded and put the envelope back in a drawer, where we also kept extra batteries and takeout menus. No shrine, no ceremony. That evening, Tom and I sat on the porch of Jamie's new place. He'd painted the railings a soft blue that matched nothing but calmed everything. There were no bugs that night, no breeze strong enough to ruin the tea. Just the two of us, and the sound of a neighborhood letting itself unwind. He looked out at the darkening sky. I never expected to love again. That word, it's a big coat. Hard to put on after it's hung too long. I didn't answer right away. The cup in my hands was still warm. I watched the steam curve upward like a slow dance. "You don't have to call it love," I said. "You can start with care." He turned his head slightly, just enough to catch my eye. "Then let me care if that's all right." I smiled, not with my lips, but with something deeper. "I think I'd like that." There were no fireworks, no strings swelling in the background, just two people side by side, not looking to fill anything, only to share the space. When I went to bed that night, I didn't replay the past like I used to. I didn't count my mistakes or rehearse my silences. I placed my earrings in a small dish beside the lamp. One of them had a missing clasp. I'd kept it anyway. Some things you hold on to not because they're whole, but because they remind you how far you've come from being broken. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't check the locks twice. The world could stay as it was. I had already let myself in. I never thought peace would sound like footsteps on hardwood that I could name as mine. The coffee pot clicks just before it finishes brewing. I wait until the steam settles into the kitchen tiles, curling up like breath against the morning. 3 mugs sit on the counter. One plain white one with a chip at the base, and mine, the one with a faint gold rim worn thin by time. We all drink it differently, but we sit at the same table. Tom folds the paper with careful creases. Jamie hums a little as he trims something out. Back, I can hear the snips through the screen door. I pour the coffee slowly, letting the scent rise. I used to think mornings were something to rush through. Now I take them in like a vow. A week ago, we stood in the backyard with a few folding chairs and nothing grand. No flower arches, no speeches rehearsed to impress. Just a handful of people who knew our names for real, not just by association. Jamie brought the chairs out early. Clary Dale, in her Sunday sweater, read something from a children's book she loved. Margie Bennett arranged the lemon bars on a tray shaped like a leaf. Haley, now interning at the library, carried a small bouquet she picked herself. Pastor Paul spoke only 10 lines, all quiet. Tom held my hands and said, "I won't rewrite what came before us, but I will walk with you through what comes next." I looked at his knuckles, at the way his fingers knew where mine went without asking. "I'm not waiting to be rescued anymore," I replied. "But I'm glad not to walk alone. No music, no applause. Just leaves brushing against each other like soft claps from trees that had seen enough." Jamie took a photo the old-fashioned way and printed it in black and white. It sits now on our mantel beside a candle Sarah brought over last fall, lavender and cedarwood. "To clear the air," she'd said. Sarah brings soup when my hands ache. She doesn't ask what kind of day I've had. She just places it on the stove and says, "I'll leave the lid loose so it doesn't boil over." The first time I saw her with Jamie, I watched their shoulders touch as they leaned over a crossword. No noise, no need to explain. I remember thinking, he's being loved the way he was meant to be. Not for what he gives or what he hides, but simply for who he is when no one is watching. One afternoon, I heard her tell Tom I chose Jamie because of the way his voice softened when he talked about his mother. She didn't know I was listening. That made it land deeper. Today, the garden is quiet except for the wind nudging the wind chimes by the fence. Jamie's planting sunflowers late, but they'll find their own rhythm. Tom's reading an article out loud about bird migration. He's not really reading to anyone, just filling the air with something that isn't silence. I sit on the porch with a small box in my lap. Inside are letters, one still folded with creases sharp from time. Jamie had written it during his deployment years ago, long before either of us knew what kind of homes we'd end up leaving or building. If someone makes you cry, it read, "I'll come get you, no matter who, no matter where." I didn't cry then. I don't now. I just close the letter slowly and place it at the bottom of the stack. Some promises don't expire. Some are fulfilled in ways we don't expect, quietly, thoroughly. I keep the box, but I don't open it much anymore. I no longer look backward for proof that I mattered. These days I feel it when Tom hands me his glasses and asks, "Is this smudge from my thumb or yours?" I feel it when Jamie makes an extra slice of toast without asking who it's for. I feel it when Sarah says, "I hope our kids have your kind of calm." They don't know what those words do to a person who was once spoken to only through slammed doors or polite nods. Tonight we sit outside again. One long bench, a soft blanket draped at one end. Tom sips slowly. Jamie rests his arm behind Sarah on the backrest like it's always belonged there. She brings out a pie still warm and says, "It might fall apart when you cut it, but the inside's good." I smile and let the warmth reach all the places I once kept guarded. No one mentions where we came from. No one names what was lost. That, too, is a kind of grace, not needing to defend the joy you've earned. I lean back, close my eyes for a second, and listen. No shouts, no whispers meant to wound. Only forks tapping lightly on plates and someone laughing soft and whole. I used to be a woman without a name in her own home. Now I am a mother, a wife, a friend, and every one of those names fits like something made for me, not borrowed, not forced, mine.